Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for joining us. Multiple use is a principle that has become more or less synonymous with public land management policy on the federal level. This is a fundamental concept, a broad-based concept that is designed to ensure that our federal public land will be made open and available for a number of different uses, including grazing, recreation, timber harvesting, mineral extraction, energy development, and so forth. Do you support the principle of multiple use?
Yes, Senator. I think my career reflects multiple use in a variety of different ways. I do.
And in your opinion, if certain traditional uses of federal land, such as grazing, were constructively phased out by the implementation of different rules and regulations, would that really be any different than explicitly preventing grazing on those very same federal lands?
Senator, I think it's important to understand what you're dealing with and understand the specific circumstances. But
as a general matter, it's possible to phase those out through a more subtle implementation of different policies. I mean, sometimes it has that effect, right?
I'm not sure, Senator, without sort of understanding the specifics of what you're getting at. I think that it's important to know what are the uses of the land, what are the impacts of those uses, what is the science behind it, bring all the parties together in a room to assess that, to assess the impacts in a variety of different ways.
You would certainly agree that as a general matter, federal land management policies ought to focus on preserving multiple use to the maximum degree possible and not eroding it.
I'm not exactly sure when you say multiple uses, it depends on, multiple uses are important. Multiple uses in the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon is a national park, and it's got its primary use, and in areas of oil and gas production or mining, that is the primary use, and I think that it's important to look at things on a case-by-case basis to understand those uses and to respect them for their value to the region and our nation. Okay.
The federal government owns about 650 million acres of land in the United States. The overwhelming majority of it, I think around 500 million acres of that will be under your jurisdiction, primarily through the Bureau of Land Management. So this total land mass that I'm talking about that is federally owned is about 30% of the land mass in the United States. Most of it, half of it or so, is located in the western United States. In every state east of the Rocky Mountains, the federal government owns 15% or less of the land. In every state, Rocky Mountains and west, the federal government owns 15% or more. In some states like mine, the state of Utah, the federal government owns 2/3 of our land. This land ownership does have benefits for American people everywhere, regardless of where they live. People enjoy hiking, recreating, visiting national parks. They benefit in different ways from different land designations that we have. And there is also an economic impact. Perhaps the most significant of which is the fact that federal public land cannot be taxed by states and local governments. Principal land taxing authorities like county governments are unable to tax it. In order to offset that, the federal government's created a program called PILT. It stands for Payment in Lieu of Taxes. Considering that the whole purpose of this program, PILT, is to offset losses in property tax revenue to these local taxing jurisdictions, would you agree that these payments should be in some way roughly equivalent to the property tax revenues that would otherwise be flowing into these taxing jurisdictions but for the federal land ownership?
Senator, I think the issue is maybe a bit more complex than a simple answer. I know that there are vast tracts of land and sparsely populated. I do appreciate that it's important that without a tax base that there be appropriate support for those communities to be able to thrive. In some cases, as we saw and Chairman Wyden brought up, the economic impact of active outdoor recreation, a $646 billion industry, some of those communities may enjoy some of those benefits.
They do. They absolutely do. And I apologize for being abrupt. I just want to make sure I get in as many questions as possible. They do benefit, and yet if you were to talk to many of them, they would acknowledge that while wonderful, the benefits from that type of tourism doesn't offset, in many cases, it doesn't even come close to offsetting between when you add in PILT and the revenue from the tourism industry doesn't even come close to offsetting the economic burden. So my point is simply, this is not a burden that should be borne solely by those federal land-rich states. Let me close just by making one more point about that that is related to it. We've got, I'll use San Juan County in Utah as an example of this, a county in rural southeastern Utah. It's a sparsely populated, very poor county. Hardworking people live there. 90% of the land in San Juan County is owned by the federal government. And so only 10% of that land is even subject to taxation. When you add on top of that federal restrictions imposed by the Endangered Species Act, an act which your department, should you be confirmed, will be administering, the impacts can be staggering, as evidenced by the fact that with the proposed listing of the Gunnison sage grouse, this could have a huge, huge impact on these local residents, in part because the critical habitat proposed by the Fish and Wildlife Service is overwhelmingly located in that 10%. The one part of the land in the county that the county can tax is the one part where the overwhelming majority of the critical habitat designated by the Fish and Wildlife Service is found. I don't know whether this is just coincidence or not. I don't think it's a coincidence because similar things happen elsewhere in my state and throughout the country. And so I'm out of time, but I ask you to consider that. And if you're confirmed to this position, please be sensitive to these local communities and make sure that people in the western United States are not bearing disproportionately a burden that ought to be borne by the entire country. Thank you.